Just a note before we start. Our show talks about touchy subjects that may be difficult for some of our listeners. Take care of yourself. If you feel you need to seek help, see the links at the end of our show notes for resources.
Hey y'all, and welcome to Touchy Subjects Podcast, the podcast that aims to break the silence that tends to come with conversations around domestic and sexual violence. I'm Sean.
And I'm Amanda.
And today we are going to be discussing supporting communities after abuse with our special guests, Angie and Earl. I am so glad to have you both back with us today.
We're excited to be with you. Thanks.
Yes. We had a great conversation last episode, so if you didn't check that one out, please go and check that one out and then come back here, because this is going to be kind of a continuation of that conversation that we were having. So really kind of jumping into it, since we're hoping they listened to the last one, so you guys don't need to introduce yourself a second time. Looking at when abuse happens in communities, especially on a large scale that we've kind of talked about a little bit at the end of last episode, that impacts not only the victims and survivors, which, yes, obviously that needs to be the primary focus, is working with them first. But that abuse also has impacts and ramifications on the community at large. So from your guys' perspective, what does that kind of end up looking like?
Well, Angie, if you're okay, I think I'll start. And I'll point out that I did my doctoral training at the University of Connecticut in Stores. And today, when you mention Stores, you're talking about basketball. When I was there, the arena was on the other side of campus and nobody went. When I think about my program of study, it was under the rubric of cities, urbanization. And the central piece to the curriculum were these professors who probably 8 out of 10 were criminologists. So we had a heavy focus on crime. And some of them were big shots, like big shots. I can tell you, for the amount of time that I stayed there, we never once mentioned or studied interpersonal violence, domestic violence, etc. Not once. Not one course, but not one paper did we ever read. And I start with that to say, there is no way you can live in a community, big or small, a town, what have you, without having this type of violence that we're talking about as a part of it. In one of our first books, we did a multi-state study. What we thought we were doing was testing a theory of the Southern subculture of violence, which basically talks about the impact of the Civil War and how the Civil War in the South would lead to the continuation across generations of violence. And so we did this study in the South and then in the North. The state in the North was Minnesota, which was also predominantly white. And one of the things I remember happening was to get out of work, get on an airplane, fly up to Minnesota, stay a day or two, take an early flight the next day, get back to campus and go teach. So it was one of these like in and out. And at that time, Chrysler had built this weird vehicle called the PT Cruiser. And this little thing we rented, or it was given to us when we got to the airport and get this thing. So the next morning or the 2 mornings later, to get to the airport was like an hour plus drive, I think. And we had to leave like 4 a.m. to catch like a 8 o'clock flight to be able to get back in time to teach.
Mhm.
So I want you folks to picture this. Here we are in pitch black, rural Minnesota. Is this visual? This isn't going to be visual, is it? It's not going to be visual.
No.
Anyway, I identify as a Black male. My co-author and colleague would identify as a white woman. So here we are, early morning, 4 a.m., 4:30, heading back to the airport, and hit something, a deer or a raccoon or something big, so that the whole thing just, the red light comes on, the steam comes out, and the car stops. And it's, I mean, this highway has no lights on it. And what we learned from the state trooper who eventually came was that some car going in the opposite direction called in to say there looked to be a a vehicle on the side of the road. So this big white guy, state trooper hat, big gun, he comes up to the car, and not only were we studying domestic violence, but we had, I think, started to address some issues about police abuse. So here we are sitting in this car, and he comes up to the window, and I'm looking over at Professor Hattery, and I'm thinking, oh, like, I mean, what are we in for here? And he's talking, we're quick telling him what we're doing, researchers, trying to get to the airport. And he says something like, and it's winter. He says something like, get in my car. So now I'm really like thinking, do we do this or do we sit tight? Because I have no idea what this dude is up to or capable of. To make a long story short, we get in the car, he turns up the heat, we start this conversation, we're telling him what our research is, and he says, you really can't see out here, but behind all these trees or whatever in these little towns is all kinds of domestic violence. Judges, magistrates, lawyers, professional people. He says, we address this all the time. And I'm thinking, wow, this is about community. This is about those classes we didn't have at the University of Connecticut. And so my introduction to this segment is Penn State, the sort of quintessential example of everything that can go wrong when you have these horrific crimes, especially crimes against children. I read this week for this segment Aaron Fisher's quote unquote memoir, Silent No More, 2012. And for the listeners, Aaron Fisher is victim number one in the Sandusky trial. There were 10 kids that were brought to trial out of probably 40, 50 at least, abused kids by Sandusky, Jerry Sandusky. And in this book, he talks explicitly about the hardships that impacted his family that he grew up in, single mother, fit the demographic of the type of kids that were brought into the Second Mile Foundation. But he also talks about his own family when he became an adult, married, divorced, separated, divorced, estranged from his children, some drugs, and the inability to just get his feet on the ground. And one of the things we use in our work is this whole concept of adverse childhood experiences. And it's clear in this book And so I'm starting here to say that, many of the survivors, most of them are still anonymous through legal documents, et cetera, in terms of the settlements and what have you. But in 2 or 3 of the other cases where people have spoken up anonymously, they all have the same story. So I think it's important to note that these communities in the aftermath are ravaged. And once the survivors come out of silence and start telling us what's happening or what has happened, their stories are very, very similar. And so I'll stop there because I do want to talk about a specific case of a survivor who was not molested by Sandusky.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, especially when it is somebody like Jerry Sandusky, Penn State had a very good football program while Sandusky was employed there. And not only was this then a potential like reckoning for like the community of like we were rooting for this guy and this guy did all these awful things to children, but a lot of those kids were in that community because of how the nonprofit worked, where it was focused on the underserved youth in this area. So not only was he harming children while being this high profile person in this community that people looked up to and respected, but he'd also created a nonprofit for the purpose, or was part of a nonprofit that was intended on helping youth. And that was where he was getting these children. So not only is this a harm to the community overall in terms of like what they were seeing, but he was using something that was also intended to help this community and then turn it into something that was furthering harm.
And so I just want to quick interject here as the non-sports person here, and let our listeners know that these cases of a person in a position of power who then uses that power to exploit other people, in this we're typically talking about sports and children, right? But it's not just the Epstein files of the world. Those are very high profile people who have like this national attention right now. Abusers are in all of these communities. And just because you don't know who maybe Jerry Sandusky is, because I don't know this specific case, just know that it's sports people in these conversations that we're having today who have used that power to, in one way or another, abuse the people in their community, children, their sports teams, the doctors who treat the athletes, things like that. So that's who we're talking about today. You don't have to know every specific person that we're talking about to just kind of understand the concept of it.
That's a great segue into where I would like to start. And that is, my introduction to this started way before the ride in the PT Cruiser. I will never forget where I was when the story came out about Jerry Sandusky, because what I could feel in my body was all of those people cheering for him and all of those people who said he was such a nice guy. He was such a nice guy. And I knew how that felt because I had been one of those people too when I was in high school. In the 7th grade, one summer, this kid disappears, right? We learned later that he had gone to rehab in the 7th grade. So you know that like there's a lot going on, right? Drug and alcohol rehab. In the context of his time in rehab, he reveals that it wasn't Jerry Sandusky. It wasn't even related to sports. It was the Boy Scout leader.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know it was the Boy Scout leader until I was a sophomore in high school when he was arrested. I thought he was amazing. He took the kids, the boys, because it was the Boy Scouts. He took the boys polar camping. He had a whole Indian dance thing where the boys changed into feathers and costumes, and it's probably terrible cultural appropriation now. But in the 1970s, I thought it was really cool. In
Mhm.
fact, I boycotted and quit the Girl Scouts because we only got to make badges and sit in, sewing and stuff like that, while the boys got to go polar camping.
Mhm.
Now I know that dozens of those boys, while they were polar camping or changing into their Indian dress costumes, were being sexually molested by the Boy Scout leader, who everybody loved. So that's kind of to your point, Amanda. It's in you. No one will know his name, although you could Google him and find out who he is if I said it. But they're in every community.
Mhm.
They're in every community, and
Yeah.
I know it's not. This isn't. You're all listening to my voice. Maybe you can hear it. It still chokes me up now to think about how I felt and how those boys then had to move through adolescence and high school and into adulthood with those experiences that we didn't talk about. We didn't talk about it. Um, Many of them ended up with all kinds. I mean, I know who a lot of them are. Ended up with all kinds of the kinds of same kinds of problems we see in these high profile cases. So I just want to underscore it does happen, and it doesn't stop with the victims. I think about all the people that those boys interacted with, including me, right? Like all the boys that the people that those boys interacted with, and what they carried, and what we didn't understand, and what we didn't talk about um, in our community.
Right, because a victim is carrying so much in themselves, and especially when you're talking about children or teens who don't have the emotional regulation, who haven't been able to do the work to heal from it because no one's acknowledging it because maybe they haven't even talked about it yet. They're carrying so much of that trauma in them. It's going somewhere. They're taking it out somewhere on someone, on something, whether that's them like closing into themselves and not interacting, or sometimes those violent outbursts that we sometimes hear or talk about. Um, but that's just a culmination of all of this trauma that's in them, that's building up, and they don't know what to do with it, and they don't know where it's got to go, and it explodes somewhere, something.
Yep.
Well,
Yeah, and there were puzzle pieces, right? As an adult, I can look back and I can say, right, I wonder about that kid in 10th grade who took his life. We never talked about what might have been going on with him, and I have no way of knowing whether he was a direct victim
mhm.
in this particular case. But I think, to Earl's point, to Amanda's point, to Sean, some of the things we talked about in the last episode, we all knew about it. I didn't know about it in the moment, but the other boys in the Boy Scout troop certainly knew about it, right? And people knew about it. And so the tethers, the tendrils, the the pieces of the thread, like a web, right, were really just infecting the whole community.
Yeah. And we often talk about, and especially in this line of work too, about how the impact of like what kids are experiencing like at home ends up shaping, like obviously shaping their futures, shaping their behaviors that they may choose to do as they're growing up as they're adults. The backdrop here on some of this conversation about like the victims of Jerry Sandusky, the victims of the Boy Scout leaders, like a lot of these kids look up to those men as those father figures. Jerry Sandusky's nonprofit worked specifically with underserved youth. So many of these children also viewed him as this father figure. So now not only do you have this abuse that's happening, it's happening from somebody who they are viewing as somebody like their dad. So looking at how that can like then it just like extrapolate out, it's like you have all of these victims who have now been harmed by somebody who they viewed as like a father figure. What are the chances that then plays a strong role in how they view relationships then with children in the future?
Uh, Angela, how do you want to, I want to really spend a few minutes talking about a victim who was not molested, but I, I don't know if you want to talk about um, the other case you have in mind before that.
Well, sure. The other case, and I want to add one last footnote to the Boy Scout leader, which will just, I think, make it even more complicated and possibly interesting for the listener. And that is that the person who hired the Boy Scout leader and supervised him, well, I went to Catholic school, and the Catholic Church ran the Catholic school, and the pastor of the Catholic Church, who was the supervisor of the Boy Scout leader, was also molesting boys. So it's a story of more than one person working probably together, right? If I look back, working probably together, certainly not holding each other accountable, that's for sure. Um, which is a great segue into the other case that I wanted to talk about, which is not personal. It feels personal when I watch the video, but Frontline did a documentary called The Silence, and I would encourage viewers to check it out if you have, if you can, watch it. It's available for free online. It's called The Silence, and it details the decades of child sexual abuse by the Catholic Church in a very remote Alaskan village called St. Michael's. And St. Michael, Alaska, in that community, a priest and his sort of deacon associate. So think pastor and Boy Scout leader who travel in tandem. This is taking place in the 60s and the 70s, same as my experience. They were eventually, it eventually all comes out, which you learn about in the documentary. But I think the most important point about it is in that remote Alaskan village, 80% of the children had been abused by one or both of these two men. And when I think about the impact of 80%, that's an entire generation of children in a community who are carrying the wounds, as you said, Amanda, and trying to work all this out. So not surprising that community has very high rates of domestic abuse, very high rates of child abuse, high rates of unemployment, high rates of drug and alcohol abuse, because that pain has to go somewhere and it blows through the community. And I could certainly never say that the community I grew up in, which is not tiny, not indigenous, and not remote, is exactly like that, but I can see the patterns. And I think about the difference perhaps in the community I grew up in is those people who had been harmed, and that harm blew through people who, some of who stayed, but many of whom left. And so they took that harm other places. Whereas in St. Michael, no one leaves, right? And so you have just a different kind of a concentration. So I'd encourage people to, it's a very difficult documentary to watch. But I think it really illustrates the ways in which the harm just is concentrated and in a community, and no one really escapes it, right? Even if they weren't a direct victim themselves.
Wow. Wow. Plus, you said everybody, I mean, it's not a community where you sort of leave and go to Seattle or New York or whatever. You're there, you have kids, your kids grow up, they're abused. I mean, it's the cycles continue. Wow. Well, I we've spent a lot of time chronicling these we call them survivors of these horrific crimes. But there's a conundrum that runs through all of these examples. And, we could just keep talking about the examples. But in the Penn State case, one of the conundrums that in a sociological sense strikes me as way out of touch with what we might want the end of the story to look like is graduate assistant coach Mike McCreary. McCreary worked for Joe Paterno, the head coach and don of what Sean told us was this magnificent and winning football program. I mean, Joe Paterno could have run for governor in the state of Pennsylvania. McCreary is a graduate assistant coach, married with a little kid, a girl. And he witnesses Sandusky molesting this kid in the shower. This is the short take. And he takes what he sees to his boss, head coach Joe Paterno. And he tells him at his breakfast table. And this is where it just blows up in ways you couldn't write the script for. McCreary is suspended, put on leave by the institution, Penn State. He was paid, initially he was paid. But his life falls apart after what seems on the face of it a heroic stance.
Mm-hmm.
He stepped forward. We in the time of human resources, with all their rules, they tell us in the workplace, do this, don't do this. He did exactly what human resources tells you to do. Go to your supervisor, report this thing that's not supposed to be happening in the workplace. And he's put on leave, and then he's eventually let go. His marriage, his estrangement from his daughter, he loses his salary. And I looked carefully in 2011, 2012, he was making $150,000. I mean, put it in perspective. Professors weren't making that kind of money in 2011, 2012. I can tell you that.
I'm pretty sure advocates don't make anywhere near that yet, right?
There's money in coaching.
So this family is destroyed. And in the accounting of his life chances after this, he kept a binder of all the places he applied for work and never received one offer. Now, he's a hero in this scenario. And if you try to trace it out with all these outlets that are available to us today, that wasn't at that time, he's gone. He got a settlement and out. Mm-hmm. But he lost his family, he lost his livelihood, and he lost his career by doing what we considered to be, in Spike Lee's term, the right thing. He did the right thing, but he still lost. Yeah. And this is what the conundrum is in these kinds of cases. Who's the villain? Who's the hero? I mean, you can't map it out because it doesn't. Even the law firm that wrote the, I think, definitive report, the Free Report in 2012, there's a whole set of documents pointing out the mistakes that they made. And all they're doing is chronicling what happened in so-called Happy Valley. So this stuff, Sean, when you said we need part 2 to talk about the aftermath is crazy. Yeah. I mean, it is unbelievably crazy to try and put something around all these cases.
Mm-hmm. And it's even when we have people who are doing the right thing, right, and they lose their position, lose their job, like, that's also going to then rely on the person who is receiving that report to also do the right thing. I just think, being in Michigan, I just think of the Larry Nassar situation where girls came out early on saying they were uncomfortable with what he was doing. They didn't believe them. The girls were not believed. So even the officers weren't believing these victims, which makes the investigation completely useless at that point. So not only were there people who were trying to report Larry Nassar, the people receiving those reports weren't following through or believing them. So not only does that then harm the community because you have somebody who's able to continue to do their harm, they're now enabled by it because they're like, oh, cool, I can get away with this consistently. And you have the people who are going to take the reports who aren't going to follow through. So not only what does that say about Larry Nassar in that situation, or Jerry Sandusky in that situation. But also, what does that tell you about other victims in those communities as well? Where if they know the person that they're going to report to isn't going to do the proper things, or if reporting in this community is actually going to cause you harm, who is going to report these crimes?
Right. And even if, years later, the investigation finally comes full term and people are being held accountable and they can say things like, oh, well, this is all the stuff that we did wrong. What good does that do a victim?
Mm-hmm.
What good does that do the person who reported and then was let go from their job? What good? That doesn't do any good, because even if somebody years later says, oh, I'm really sorry that that happened to you, you still have years or decades of the fallout of it that nothing can change that. Nothing can fix it.
This might seem like an odd kind of statement, but I've been thinking a lot about these cases and the importance and the impact of the victim impact statement. But I wonder what it would look like if we took the victim impact statement 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, because I think in that moment of, the sort of heightened emotion and someone's finally listening, I maybe only lived a few years since then, and I can speak about the horrors or the impact or whatever all those things are. And that's important. But I'd like to, not that I'm asking people to do it, because I don't want to ask a victim to write a victim impact statement they don't want to write.
Right.
But what would it look like if we revisited, to your point, Amanda, 20 years later, and you have the hindsight to think back and realize it wasn't just that job I lost, it was that my daughter never got to go to college because the money that should have been in the 401k or whatever isn't in the 401k anymore, or whatever all those things are, right?
Mm-hmm.
The impact doesn't end when someone is held accountable, even an institution, right? We don't even really know what the impact is at that point.
It's even one of the things I bring up when I talk about domestic violence, because people are like, oh, if they leave the relationship, like they're good now. It's like that stays with them. When someone's experiencing a trauma, it's not like you get out of the traumatic situation or like the trauma is also gone. It's like the damage has been done, and that damage is going to have ramifications later on down the line, because that trauma is now impacting how not only you navigate the world around you, but what options are available to you to navigate the world around you. Because if you, as a result of this thing, lost your job and now you can't find another one, you have more barriers that have been put in place that were not there had you not experienced that trauma to begin with.
I wonder what it would look like. And this is a sort of loosely formed thought because I haven't quite carried it out to the end of the thread yet. But I wonder what it would look like if we reimagined the impact of child sexual abuse, domestic violence, sexual violence on people and communities, the same way that we have grown to understand the impact of hundreds of years of enslavement or hundreds of years of colonization, that affirmative action can't turn around 400 years of lack of access, or requiring people to live on a reservation. Maybe this is maybe that's a frame we need to think about when we think about the impact of these experiences as well. And not just on the individual, but to our point today, we're talking about the community. So it doesn't have to be if you're an Indigenous person or a Black person living today that you were enslaved, right? Those patterns and those opportunities are shaped for hundreds of years. Maybe we need to think about these issues that way as well, or what might be gained from doing that is maybe a better way to ask the question.
And I know Amanda mentioned Epstein. I know it's clear that when you have a chance to take the settlement, you take it. If that Gloria Aldred tells us, if you get a chance to take the money, take it. But we also know in so many of these cases that the money doesn't solve the problem. The money doesn't take care of the deep, deep traumas. And as I mentioned earlier, I couldn't find cases of of at least these 10 boys that took settlements, that their lives were great. That, wow, I got this money and now I can just move on and do whatever everybody else does. It doesn't solve it. And I don't want to downplay the fact that you shouldn't take the settlement when you can get it, but it doesn't solve the problem at all. We also have a side gig where we spend time interviewing those who have been incarcerated and eventually exonerated, which is a fascinating field of inquiry. So you spend all this time in prison and then you get out, and if the state fesses up truthfully and pays you for the time you've spent, many of those exonerees end of their lives don't end well. I don't care how much millions of dollars they got. They spent 15, 20, 30 years in prison for a crime they didn't commit. And so, I think we're in unison here talking about the fact that we got to find a better way for accountability that helps the survivors. What is it that we can do to help people who've been wronged, who've been harmed? I don't have the answer.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Well, and if we're looking at kind of like the flip side of it too, is that when these things go through like a civil court, because most often domestic and sexual violence cases are going to go through a civil court, the threshold needed to get a guilty conviction there is much lower than it is in criminal court. The issue with that is that while, yes, the victims may receive some sort of financial benefits, like some financial supports from winning a case in civil court, the message that comes from that is that if you have enough money, you can get away with doing these crimes. The messaging that comes from that is you have had something terrible happen to you. The best we can do for a recourse for this is to give you some money. That person's not going to see jail time. Only 3% of rapists will ever see 1 day in jail. They're not going to receive any real punishments for it. Yes, their reputation may be hindered for a little while, but they'll recoup it. But that victim, the trauma that they've experienced, is going to stay with them, and there's no amount of money that is going to negate the traumatic harm that has been done. It can help, but that trauma is going to be there still. So it's really unfortunate that oftentimes the best things that we can do for victims is we can get you some money. Which again, yes, money helps.
Think about how you get it. You get it after you sign a ton of documents that says you'll never, ever, ever bring this up again. And the person who committed the harm can simply say, I didn't do it, but I'm gonna pay you anyway, so you can go away. It's classic. I mean, I think if I have it right, I think Bill Cosby's case is in that category. There's so many of them. I didn't do it, but I'm gonna give you a little bit of money to go away and never bring it up again. That has to add to the trauma, I would think.
Yeah. And then when they're even able to get the criminal conviction in like Bill Cosby's case, he gets let out because of that technicality.
Wasn't even in writing. I mean, one of the technicalities wasn't even in writing. It was a conversation between these legal people. It's crazy, and to me it all goes back to the people who are harmed carry the burden in a system like our legal system that is lopsided. I think is lopsided.
Yeah.
Sean and I's work is in prevention, right? Violence prevention. And we know that the best way to prevent violence from happening is to teach the future would-be perpetrators how to have more respect and things like that for like fellow people. Absolutely the basis of prevention work, right? But there is also this piece of harm reduction
Mhm.
where it gets a little bit of a bad flex, I think, in a lot of people because it feels like a victim blaming. It feels like the victim has to be the person to take responsibility to protect themselves, blah, 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 right? And absolutely, while that is completely true, we would never expect a victim to, it's not your job to prevent something from happening to you. But I use the analogy of when I come to a crosswalk and I'm walking down the road, even though my little light is flashing with the walkie guy, I
Mhm.
still look both ways.
Mhm.
Because if somebody doesn't follow that rule and hits me with their car, I am still the person who is going to have to suffer through that. I'm the person who's going to be in the hospital with a broken leg, with a broken hip, and now have years of recovery because someone else didn't follow the law, right? So no one's going to look after you as well as you can look after yourself. No one's going to put you as number one all the time. So I'm a big proponent of, maybe have just a little bit of that. We got to have some self-awareness of what's going on around us. It's not our fault. It's not our responsibility to make sure other people follow the law. But unfortunately, we live in a world where people don't.
Yeah. And I will say I'm one of the people in prevention work that has like the slight issues with risk reduction, only because people will say they are doing prevention work and they're only doing risk reduction.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's like they'll see the risk reduction stuff. It's like, that is us doing prevention. I was like, that's not preventing it. Just because you maybe have taught somebody how to do all the right things and it works out in that situation so they don't end up being assaulted, that does not mean that person's not going to assault somebody else. So risk reduction works as a way to keep somebody safe, but if that is where the end point for your prevention work is, that is not prevention.
If I could
Yes.
add to that, I would also, because this is the topic of your podcast, I kind of love the analogy of the crosswalk. That, I mean, we ride bikes, and if if you get hit by the car, like even if it was you had the right of way, like you're the one that's going to be paying for that, right?
Mhm.
I think when I think especially about child sexual abuse, um, we don't know what to look for. And it isn't the car that's coming down the street that is going to be the indicator that there's a problem. It's the tiny little, I don't know, match car that's coming, that if we allow it to get close enough to us, the car will get bigger and bigger. I mean, this is what grooming is about, right? So I think part of the challenge in that part of prevention is not only do we not talk about it, but which we should be talking about it, which is why we're here. And that's what I love about your podcast. But also,
Talk.
well, but sophisticated groomers don't show up as a semi truck in the crosswalk, right?
Yeah.
They show up as, and you think about any of these cases, they show up, whether it's Sandusky or in St. Michael, Alaska, or in my community, they show up as the cool guy. Who doesn't want to go polar camping? Polar camping is awesome, right? And the first time we go polar camping and it turns out that your sleeping bag is next to mine, I don't think anything about it. And the next time, and the next time, and pretty soon you're in my sleeping bag molesting me, right? And so I think part of the challenge is it's more than just we need to tell kids, prevention. It's that we don't, it's hard to even see when it's coming, right?
Yeah.
Until you've already been run over by the truck.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a huge challenge. And I applaud you guys for doing that work because I think that's a huge challenge.
It is
And
really
hard.
hard because it makes, I'm sorry, I cut you off there, but it makes adults acknowledge the fact that this is something that could be happening. And the adults then have to take a step back and be like, okay, do I need to worry about the Boy Scout leader? I mean, I the world today is, I think, a little bit more cautious, a little bit more vigilant when it comes to some of those things, but not everybody. But when you're looking at the 70s, when you're looking at the 80s, like people just trusted their children to go with those people because that was what you did. Kids go to camp. Kids join the Boy Scouts. Kids join the Girl Scouts. Kids play sports and they're going to go see the sports doctor. Like we had an inherent trust of these people that really came back and bit a whole 2, 3, decades of life in the butt.
Look, we're in the middle of a book pulling together these big cases that involve doctors and coaches. And so when Sean mentioned Nasser, it hits me that this guy was so slick in his grooming process that he was abusing these young girls with their parents in the room. Okay. I mean, he had it down pat that what I'm doing here is this medical procedure. And he didn't care if the parents were in the room. He continued to do it. Amanda mentions camp. They camped out at Caroli's Ranch in Texas, where they sent the best gymnasts in the world to work out. And who was the doctor? Nasser. Did he abuse those women down there? He did. And through the legal process, he sits in jail for something that they could convict him on, but not the abuse in Texas. I mean, the stuff is wild.
I want to come back to something you said a little bit ago, Sean, and that is that I think part of the challenge, but a place where we can move a lever is when we think about, we've been talking about the grooming process, and there's a famous story in the Jerry Sandusky case about a mom who freaks out when her kid comes home from camp with Sandusky and his hair's wet because they've been in the shower. And she's like, whoa, wait, that doesn't feel good to me, right? Like, that's not cool. It's back to the cop you mentioned, the officer receiving the complaint. Because we don't talk about it and we have a culture of not believing victims, I think one lever we can move is training and empowering people to ask another question, whether it's a parent or a police officer. We've built a culture around rape myths and myths about child sexual abuse that it's not a big deal, that it doesn't matter, that they'll get over it, that all that stuff, that thing when you took the shower, well, that's not abuse, or that medical exam you had, well, that's not abuse. And so we've built this sort of lack of accountability cage, but it's on the foundation of a lack of belief, right? We need to believe children. When children say something happens, we need to believe them. And if it turns out that it was just a shower and nothing crazy was going on, then that'll come out. But that's one lever where I think we can make a difference.
Yeah, it was something I mentioned at the end of our last episode before, after we had recorded, because that brings up the point that the thing I wanted to call out was the documentary Roll Red Roll. Because the whole premises of this episode today is talking about how these things impact community. Roll Red Roll is a phenomenal documentary about that. So if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it. But in that documentary, this girl is sexually assaulted by these football players, and the community backs the players. So if we're looking at how communities can work on impacting these things, believing victims is the easiest way to do that. Because not only had she been believed in that moment, would those players have potentially been punished for what happened to them much sooner, and she would have been able to get into services to be able to help her out more quickly. But then that community also sends the message that we are not going to support sexual assault, people who have sexually assaulted others. Because when they were backing and supporting that player, that's the message. That says you are not safe to report a sexual assault in this community because you are not going to be believed. And why would somebody who's already experienced a sexual assault and experienced that trauma then report it, knowing that community is also going to attack them for choosing to make that report of something that's awful that has happened to them?
And we
Sean.
also know that in cases of child sexual abuse, kids often start with something very mild to see if they will be believed. So if they talk about, they come home with the wet hair and no one raises an eyebrow, or they talk about the fact that their sleeping bag was close to the Boy Scout leader and no one asks another question, they're not going to tell you that that was just the tip of the iceberg. Right. So if we start by giving kids space to talk about those things and ask questions, often we can elicit sooner and earlier in the process what's really going on. Sorry, Earl, I've kind of cut you off.
Well, I know we got to go, but Tom Osborne had a reputation similar to Joe Paterno. Tom Osborne was the king out in Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska. Nebraska at some point was a top football program. Think about all the cases at Nebraska where the victims were not believed. So what happens to Tom Osborne? I mean, he's there, he's hiding it. He's elected senator, I think, of Nebraska. It's unbelievable how these folks who are right in the mix of it, who don't stand up for those people who are being harmed, turn around and get elected to high positions. That was then. We're seeing the same thing happening today. Okay? The same thing happening today. So believing, how do you get people to believe? I mean, we've all been kids. We come home, we're telling our parents, some kid knocked me down or pushed me in the creek or whatever. And sometimes they believed you and sometimes they didn't. I mean, believing is hard.
As I think to some of the points that Amanda and Sean have made, we grew up in a time, many of us, and I think it still happens, so I don't want to say it's not still happening, where the question the parent often asks is, what did you do? Who started it? What did you do?
Exactly.
Right? So we need to retrain the way we respond as parents, as teachers, as counselors, in whatever, way we're interfacing with children. Let's not start by blaming them for what happened in any capacity, like in anything, right? What did you do is probably not the first question we should be asking.
Yeah.
I think I've heard that a lot.
One other situation I want to bring up, because I like to bring it up whenever humanly possible. Brock Turner.
Mm-hmm.
Brock Turner was caught sexually assaulting someone behind
Chanel
a dumpster
Miller.
on a college campus. I believe it was on the college campus still. Was caught doing it by two people who then chased him down and held him until the police arrived. And because he had a wealthy father, because he was a really good swimmer and had a promising future, he spent 3 months in a county jail after being convicted. And then the judge who passed the sentence eventually had to leave his position because of the huge uproar around it or whatever. And then he went on to coach a high school girls tennis team. So we're pushing these harmful people out into the world because now, are any of those girls on that high school tennis team safe? Absolutely not. Not when you have somebody who's like, it's okay. We don't want to ruin his future because of this.
I think his father is famous for saying, why should my son pay this consequence for 12 minutes of a mistake or something?
12 minutes, I think it was like 10 minutes of action.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And this also brings up, if we're talking about community as a whole, right? When you have people who have done these harms, then end up being elected into positions of power, where they then are the ones who get to vote on what policies or legislation is going to be enacted. You have people who do not view women as equals because they sexually assaulted them. You have people who do not view children as their equals. So they're not going to vote for policies and legislation that are going to put in guardrails to protect them. They may say that they want those things to get themselves elected. But when you have a lot of people in these positions of power that have done harm in the past and do not see the harm that they've done, they're using that mindset on how they're viewing these policies and legislation. So when we elect people who have done harm, we are electing people who may have that viewpoint then to not enact policies that would help their victims.
I can't let this pass. I can't let this
let
pass.
it pass either. I can't let mine pass.
All right, you go first, and then I get my shot.
I don't know if Jim Jordan's guilty, Ohio State wrestling, but there's documentaries out there, etc. We're going to write about it in this book. But people claim that he knew what was going on at Ohio State. And he, Sean, is in a position of power. Mm-hmm. He heads up powerful committees in Congress. And you wonder what his thinking is, if in fact he knew what was happening when he was coaching. That was mine.
Okay, I can't let this one go. So y'all gonna have to buckle in for a second. And if you're Catholic or spent time in a Catholic school or a Catholic church, the architect of the official policy for the Catholic Church response to child sexual abuse was written by the person who eventually becomes Pope Benedict. The person who is the architect of the cover of all of the policies that lead to the cover-up that say, you know, if a case comes to you, your job is to tell the victim, go somewhere else or you'll be excommunicated. We're not going to listen to this. That person rises to be the spiritual leader of the Western world. Mm-hmm. The very person.
What's the policy?
It's called crimen solicitationis. It's a long Latin word, and it basically says if you make a claim of abuse against a priest or someone serving in a capacity in Catholic Church, and it is unfounded, you can be excommunicated by the church, which for a Catholic means you can no longer be a member of the church, which means you can't get the sacraments, which means you can't go to heaven if you're Catholic, right? Mm-hmm. So it sets up talk about a barrier of a standard. So who's going to report, right? And when you do report, the official policy is sweep it under the rug, move the priest to another location, mm-hmm. et cetera, and so forth. And it's just to underscore the point, and you can read about this. We've written about it. Lots of other people have written about it. The point is the person who designed the policy rises to the highest leadership position in an organization that leads, 1 billion Catholics or whatever. So there is reward for protecting the institution, not for protecting the victims.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And that kind of goes to some of the conversation we had last episode where we talked about like sports as an institution. Institutions, businesses, governments, their main purpose is they need to keep what they have in place. And if they're not able to do that, they are not going to thrive. The NFL does not thrive if they do not have good athletes. So the NFL needs to make sure their good athletes get on the field because that makes their product more valuable. The Catholic Church does not survive if you have to consistently remove tens of hundreds of priests because of the abuse that they're using, the abuse that they're doing to people in their communities. Because if you do that, you run out of priests. Not saying every priest does this, right? Like I want to make that clear as I'm making this statement. But it's if you have enough people who are doing harm and you remove them from those positions, if they don't have the infrastructure to keep going. So these institutions have to make sure that they keep these people in their positions of power, maybe moving them somewhere else, giving the NFL player a slap on the wrist because of the harm that they did. Because if you're good enough at what you do, these institutions need you in those positions, which is not a fun note to have, but that is how they're going to operate. That's why they move the priests and the cardinals to different areas, because if they don't do that, they're losing these people.
And I think it comes back to Amanda's policy comment. They're not just setting policy, they're also communicating to the community. This is real and this isn't. This counts and this doesn't. So someone who has, let's say, engaged in sexual assault in a college setting, that is not matter enough to prevent them from sitting on the highest court of the land. A judge who sits and says, well, what Brock Turner did is not really that big of a deal, is that culture then, that norm is set. Fine, go ahead and coach girls tennis, because even if something happens, it's not really that bad, right? So it's both setting the policies and setting the beliefs and culture, cultural norms around it.
Yeah,
This
we
is
need
like-
to continue this conversation. I don't know how or when or where, but we haven't even touched the problems of institutional betrayal in sports world.
Yeah.
We haven't touched it.
Yeah.
There are so many examples that can be verified, and the perpetrators walk. Perpetrators walk. I mean, I just learned from Amanda, who's been telling us she doesn't pay attention to sports. Something about Brock Turner that I did not know. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So
I'm glad I could be of service today.
Well, this is like part of like me, like the anarchy kind of part of it is like, if we're trying to get community involved in helping make people and build communities that are more supportive of victims and provide a better infrastructure for victims to get the services they need, and then so we also see victims less often. If the institutions and systems in your community do not exist, if we were to start to hold people who have caused abuse accountable, maybe we just need to destroy those systems. Because if those systems are going to still exist, they need, like I said, they need those people. So those people aren't going to be removed. They're going to figure out a way to make sure that they remain, which means we probably just need to correct and fix the whole system up to that point.
The Epstein files, like that's literally all this is. Right? People have said, oh, we can't release all the names on the Epstein files because the government would collapse. Then let it collapse. If that's what's holding it up, let it burn down, because that is not what. Look, I am in no way condoning any kind of violence. This isn't a political I mean, I guess it is kind of a political stance, but it's not meant to be. But like Sean just said, if the entire institution is being held up by the lies, the secrets, and on the backs of victims, then what are we doing still supporting that?
It's the Black feminist Audre Lorde famously said, we can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And what she means is essentially, at some point, you gotta take on the institution, right? Because replacing the individuals isn't going to ultimately make any difference, because it's the institution that's causing the most harm, right?
Yeah. If we talk about doing systems change work in this work that Amanda and I do, because that's our job. The end goal of prevention is creating and changing systems to create that better infrastructure for victims and survivors. If the system was created by people who were doing harm to make sure that they could stay in positions of power, the system itself has been created to support abusers. So we have to look at, how do we change that system? And if we can't change that system, how do we dismantle it in a way that is going to then be better supportive of victims and survivors and not supportive of abusers?
Part 3. Right there. That's
Mic drop.
Part 3.
And the logo for it, I have a t-shirt that says the patriarchy isn't going to smash itself. That can be our logo for part 3.
Okay, I love that. I need that t-shirt. That's awesome.
Cool. Well, thank you both so much for joining us again today. It is always a pleasure having you both on to talk to you. Like we joked, maybe there's a part 3 in here. More than happy to have you all back for a part 3 as well. But again, before we sign out, is there just one note that you want to leave off on for our audience?
I'd like to say that I'm hoping that for your listeners, they've gained some insights into the various pieces of this puzzle, whether it's, the cases themselves, whether it's our calling for accountability, whether it's, changing the system that allows for these issues to just keep rolling forward over and over and over. I think you folks have set up something that gives people, quote unquote, food for thought, for sure.
Again, thank you for having us. It's fun to talk about this stuff. I think the last thing I would say is, last time I said believe victims. This time I will add to that, believe victims, but also understand, as we talk about communities, that you may not be the direct victim, but if it's happening in your community, you are going to become a victim at the level of quote, like collateral impact. If we don't stop this in our communities, we have no shot at preventing other things that do harm, like abusing substances, the intergenerational transmission of violence, all of those things. So eventually you're going to pay for it. So do you want to pay for it now, or do you want to pay for it later?
Yeah. These crimes and these harms impact entire communities, not just the direct victims of the assaults. And when we start to realize that, it makes it much easier for us to start doing the prevention work that actually needs to be done. So again, thank you both so much for joining us today. If they want to find you online, where can they find you?
Our website is www.smithandhattery.com, which is SMITHANDHATTERY.com. We'd love to have you visit the website, reach out to us. It'd be great to be in more conversations.
Yes.
Thank you so much for bringing all of your knowledge and all of your expertise to our show. We have really appreciated having these conversations.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
for the
you.
invitation.
Yes, and I'll make sure I have a link to their website in the show notes. I highly recommend to check it out. It's a great resource. And again, thank you both for joining us. And thank you all for listening today. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at TouchySubsPod to keep up to date when we have new episodes and other content coming out. Please email us any questions, comments, or concerns to touchysubjectspodcast@gmail.com. And please rate and follow us on your favorite podcast listening app. It really does help the show out.
And in the meantime, don't be afraid to challenge, ask, and discuss when it comes to touchy subjects.